Host of the Katie Halper Show and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast, Katie Halper herself is here with us today. Nice to see you, Katie.
Nice to see you too.
We hear that one of our favorite Texas Democrats introduced an interesting bill recently. Why don't you break it down for us?
Yeah, so progressive Dem fave, Henry Cuellar, who, of course, I should remind people that this is a Texas congressman who is anti-choice when it comes to reproductive rights, A+ or A rating from the NRA, and he very narrowly defeated Jessica Cisneros, who was challenging him in Texas. And the reason he won narrowly, was able to defeat her, was thanks to Democratic leadership who showed up for him. They went down there in person. They did some in-person stumping. They robocalled for him. They obviously endorsed him. You had Nancy Pelosi, James Clyburn, and Steny Hoyer helping get the vote out for him. And he, surprisingly enough, is not only anti-choice and great on gun rights. I use the word great sarcastically, obviously, but he's terrible on labor. And so he co-sponsored this bill, which is deceptively called the Worker Flexibility and Choice Act, which basically erodes workers' rights by allowing employers to require that workers sign away their basic rights as a condition of work. And it's a carve-out of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And that in itself, what that does is that guarantees things like minimum wage and overtime pay. And I'm just going to quote the bill, if you'll allow me to, trigger warning, but it says that a worker flexibility agreement means that, quote, may include other requirements, but states the entity has offered and the individual has chosen to enter into an arrangement whereby the individual is not subject to the minimum wage and overtime protections of this act and is not treated as an employee under the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 and related state and local laws. End quote. So basically, these workers won't get minimum wage or overtime pay. And this bill is based on this false dichotomy between flexibility on the one hand and Fair Labor Standards Act on the other. And it's important to note that they are compatible. The Fair Labor Standards Act and worker flexibility is compatible. So this is a false choice. And it's, basically propaganda. And we shouldn't be surprised by this. I mean, this is the same type of kind of charade that goes into naming different things that are actually bad for workers, pretending that they're good for workers, and like right to work states, for instance.
I'm gathering that this is aimed at what? Uber drivers, that kind of thing, gig employees, that kind of deal?
Well, what's scary about this is that this is kind of like an Uberification of the workforce in general. So we already had Prop 22, thanks in part to, Obama alums, so shout out to them. But we already had Prop 22, which enabled Uber and similar corporations to not pay minimum wage, overtime, to do all sorts of things that are very against, workers' rights. Because these people aren't classed as employees, they are gig workers, so they can do whatever they want. And this is kind of an expansion of that into the larger workforce.
Yeah, so Robbie, I'm kind of curious about how you feel about this.
Right, totally in support.
How libertarian are you? Is there a such thing as a worker's right that you would want to protect?
This is going to be philosophical. The company wants to pay you this. You say, I want you to pay me this. If there's agreement, then there's a contract, and then you do the work, and they pay you that. So we're introducing a third party. This is like a I consent, I don't, I'm Jesus kind of thing. You're saying the government has to intrude into this interaction between an individual and a company that agree to collaborate productively, and you're saying I have a problem.
Yeah, I mean, so I wouldn't frame it as,
I'm not okay with this.
I wouldn't frame it as the government intruding. I would frame it as workers fighting for decades in mass movements to create laws that got passed against the overwhelming corporate interests that we're trying to keep it from getting passed.
Prop 22 was passed with 60% of California voters.
That provided for basic labor rights that most Americans enjoy, like a 40-hour work week, like overtime pay, like things like that. And the reason why we established unions and why people fought for those kind of rights to begin with, and to have a government agency that's ostensibly designed to protect workers' rights, is because the gains to trades aren't equal. They're not equal bargaining positions when you are a human being with a family who needs to eat and resist homelessness by being evicted, and there's a corporation who's saying, I can pay you the absolute bare minimum because you need to stay alive. You need, in fact, to work for me to even have health care. So do you see that as a fair bargaining position that employees are in, and that we should be thrown to the vagaries of the markets and just be forced to pay the bare minimum that any organization is willing to offer us because we're under the constraints of having to stay alive?
We're talking about gig employees. Prop 22 was supported by, passed with 60% of California voters.
No, we're not talking about gig employees. The point that Katie was making is that this is an extension of the policy that's become the norm for gig employees, intruding into the normal workplace. The
intrusion is being done by the government saying, we will make it illegal for you to offer this salary and have this. If you don't like the salary, you don't have to work for it. But two entities are agreeing, and then a third party is saying, we're voiding your agreement because we don't like it.
What should the person do
but I think
doesn't work?
The order is wrong. I think the order is wrong. The government has already said this, right? Like if you said that the Uber thing passed the 60%. Okay, so this passed. This was codified into law, the Fair Labor Act, and this is a carve out of that. So it's not like the government is reaching in and trying to disrupt a natural relationship. And also, as Bree referred to, it's not like they have equal bargaining power. And it kind of reminds me of like a cop. To me, this reminds me of a cop leaning on someone to sign away their rights to a lawyer. Mm-hmm. There's a similar dynamic with that in terms of who has the power in the situation. And of course, a lot of people, if they're desperate to work, they're not going to feel like, and the whole point is that they're not in union, so they have no negotiating power. If we had a more union organized workforce, then things like this wouldn't happen. But to me, it's very clear that this allows for exploitation. I think there's a debate to be had, obviously, Robbie, you as a libertarian, but I think that besides that debate, what we do see is mass hypocrisy on the part of Democrats who claim to be the workers' party. And of course, like Joe Biden says he's going to be the most pro-worker Democrat, and then you have the Democratic leadership stumping for this guy who, by the way, just so you know, this is a bill that was co-sponsored with a MAGA Republican who thinks that the election was stolen. So lest you have any doubts about the kind of ideological orientation of something like this. And again, with Democrats like these, who needs Republicans? But it's just shameful that we have people like this who are claiming to be Democrats. And this woman, her name is Elise Stefanik, and she's a big-time MAGA person, so she's the co-sponsor. I just want to add one more thing that I left out, which is that this bill is backed by a corporate lobby group called the Coalition for Workforce Innovation, CWI, which is established basically to fight against workers' movements and workers' gains. And the companies include Amazon, Target, Amway, Google, Kroger, FedEx, Facebook, Uber, Apple, Lyft, Microsoft, and DoorDash, among others. Oh, and Walmart and Instacart. So, yeah.
I would just add, in the specific example of Uber, so Uber prices for people using Uber are getting more and more expensive. Fewer people are going to be using it. If the government makes it so that it just might become affordable, so that the company passes the increased cost of whatever additional regulation or pay they have to give, passes that on to the customers, and so then fewer people use Uber, so then people can't make more money anyway. It was working fine at the pre-existing level, and then the government's going to come in and wreck it because it decided that it was uncomfortable with the people agreeing to work for this amount of money.
That's a counterfactual. Uber won that fight. Uber workers don't have rights. So Uber as an institution won that fight. Uber is expensive and becoming more expensive because it was never a sustainable business to begin with. They used venture capital investments to artificially lower the cost, get people hooked on the use of Uber, and then jack the cost up to finally start to turn a profit. These companies are not profitable, and it has nothing to do with benefits going to the drivers. It was all a Ponzi scheme to begin with.
And they did a lot of misleading advertising. I mean, a lot of the Uber ads, the Prop 22 ads, had people of color, faces on it, which is great. Of course, the people who are most exploited by these systems happen to be people of color. So this is a larger discussion about dishonest advertising, but we shouldn't be surprised. And, interestingly enough, there's a lot of Saudi money that went into passing Prop 22.
Yeah, and to be clear, this isn't the real insidiousness of this here, Katie, if I'm understanding you correctly, is not that it's this in this world where we've been having this conversation about what is going on rights-wise in the gig economy. We're talking about people having carve-outs in the regular labor market. I just saw a story about a Chick-fil-A in North Carolina so stressed that it can't get people to come and work for its pennies, it's minimum wages, that it's offering people $5 chicken sandwiches an hour to come and work their lunch shift. I mean, there's this, what we're seeing now with these conversations about the labor market and, you know, the economy and these kind of countervailing trends where there is lower unemployment, but we saw in the context of the pandemic, people starting to complain about that because they could not constrain workers in the ways that they typically could. People had more flexibility, more options, in part because of some of the COVID relief, but in part because people have reorganized their lives post-COVID to try to get some flexibility. And what we see is that these institutions, these employers, do not like it when workers have any bargaining power whatsoever. What's so confusing to me is that these politicians get away so flagrantly with being anti-worker, and that citizens seem not to see themselves as workers, but only as consumers, worried about the price of a Chick-fil-A sandwich.
Because we are all consumers.
So
we are not all workers in specific industries, but we are all consumers.
We all are workers, and we are not all consumers in specific industries. You can flip that either way. And at the end of the day, we used to have a tradition in this country where we respected the idea that people should get paid fairly for their labor, and politicians were jockeying to be the person in the position to prove that they could improve the life of the American worker, not bring down costs on a pack of potato chips.
The services of Uber improve the life of the American worker. They prove everyone's like, this is exactly what's wrong with the left. Something innovative comes along that makes people's life easier, allows some people to make some money on the side, an easier way to get around, and you guys break it because you're offended that the labor dispute is wrong.
With all due respect, Uber is not the subject of this panel. Uber has nothing to do with this law. You're kind of talking about Uber in the context of this conversation. Nobody here is anti-Uber. Uber is failing because it's a business that failed. And as a libertarian, you should respect that if the markets speak, the markets speak. It has nothing to do with regulation. The Prop 22, Uber won its fight.
I mean, the Prop 22 does force them to do all sorts of things. It's not as bad as what Democrats wanted them to do. It also forces them to do all sorts of things.
They're sinking and swimming on their own metal. And Uber, again, is not what's going on. It's not the point of this segment. The point of this segment is that there are increasing encroachments into the labor sector that are stripping workers of rights. I think you're clear on the fact that you think that that is something that people have to deal with on their own, but it's going to be up to voters to decide whether or not they want, after corporations have paid enormous amounts of money to get the government to be antithetical to their interests instead of supporting their interests the way they were in yesteryear, whether they want to start voting for politicians who will stand up and protect their rights over the rights of corporations. Thank you, as always, Katie, for weighing in here.
I would just say that it's not a level playing field, which is why you need these protections, because it's not like the magic hand or whatever, Adam Smith thing is going to work and make corporations act in any ethical way. So it's not fixed by the market.
As an employer, I could say all kinds of things. Maybe, and employers do this. This is why we have regulations around this as well. Say, okay, if you want to work for me, you have to offer me sexual favors. And if you don't, you have the choice not to work for me. But people all over the world do, in fact, submit to those kinds of things, which no one could argue they actually want to do, because labor markets are that constrained, people's choices are that constrained, and that's why we try to have these balancing, counterbalancing institutions like labor unions, et cetera. But this is a robust conversation that I'm sure we'll continue to have.
Last thing I want to say is that, again, Biden has claimed that he wants to be the most pro-labor president. To the extent that that's true, this is obviously undermining that agenda. And Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and James Clyburn, this is on you. So thank you for introducing and preserving the political career of a person who is terrible not only on abortion rights, but also on labor. And you should be ashamed of yourself.
Thank you, Katie Halper.
Thank you. Thanks.
And we will have more Rising for you after this.